Welcome to the Keeping IT Real podcast. This podcast features honest and transparent conversations about what it takes to manage corporate technology and expenses today. Each episode, listen to true and personal stories from IT professionals who are working hard to make sure their business stays connected and competitive. I'm your host, Jethro Castillo, and let's meet our next guest. Today, I am joined by Joe Silva, the IT Director of Data and Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Kelly Moore Paints. Joe has over 20 years of experience in the IT and cybersecurity space, providing organizations with the technology solutions they need, both in the immediate and the long term. With Kelly Moore shutting down, Joe also finds himself in a unique situation. And in this podcast, Joe will also talk about what it's like to go through a closeout as an IT leader. Joe, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How did you really get started in the world of IT?
I actually got started way back in high school, just kind of hobby computing, doing some stuff with my dad and just getting interested in PCs. And then I went in the Army for communications. When I was in the Army, we often cross-trained in other jobs. That was like a normal thing. Like you need to be able to cover, other people. So when I was in communications, I learned other communications jobs. And I did a similar thing in IT. I learned to administer servers. I learned to configure networks. Then I got into email, and got into email security a little bit and all of that. Got into websites, got into a little bit of web development and also some web security. Then I circled back kind of to a core area, got into databases, did a couple data warehouses. So by the time I had my first opportunity to be an IT director, I had done almost every job that I would be supervising. And I'm not saying that's for everyone. Some jobs you're not going to get, some jobs you're not going to be good at, but that spending time and exposure and actually spending, in some cases, a year in a different job meant that when I became an IT director, I could at least speak with some background to each of the jobs I was supervising. That's just my perspective and my approach. Like I said, it may not be for everyone, but it worked really well for me in having the exposure across the different disciplines of IT.
And like you said, it's not for everyone, but I think there's something really important about that, about being able to talk the talk, but walk the walk as well. And obviously it doesn't mean that you dove in deep in all of them necessarily, and you're still doing that job for like 15, 20 years. But like you said, to be able to talk about it. And so you're not just this director or this manager of like, oh, I don't really know what you're talking about. Do whatever you want. You're able to actually have input. And I think that gives you a lot of credibility as a leader if you're able to meet them in the trenches where they're at and help them and ask questions in a way that makes sense to them. And so I think while you admit that it's not for everyone, which I agree with, I think there's a lesson to be learned there no matter who you are, of just like, it's really important to kind of do, right? And learn and take that with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really awesome.
I would share one other thing, in looking at the IT world, is because we've become so dependent on technology, we are in a position where, like the recent issue, with, CrowdStrike, that issue that seems so impactful, even though it was, less than 1% of all Windows machines in the world.
Yeah.
But it seems so significant in the media, is that technology, because of our dependence on it, is sort of a place where I would almost say, and maybe people can relate to this because of the Olympics going on right now, it's a place where you have to do everything right to win. And not just everything right, like everything has to go right. Like nothing has to go wrong that you don't control. Because there's things that can go wrong that you don't have control on. And so, that is part of the challenge with technology, is that we either have to make no mistakes, or we have to be in a position where we can recover very quickly from any mistake that does happen. And if at all possible, recover from those mistakes without anyone knowing. We saw something go wrong. we fixed it. The users never even noticed. And I find that an interesting challenge, that challenge of, some would say it kind of the duck on water thing, right? The duck looks smooth above the water. And that's sort of IT departments, right? They look great when all the technology is working right, even though there are days when, you go in the IT room, back when we had like an office for, whole IT department, in the early 2000s, for example, that you're in a position where IT's running around doing a lot of stuff because something's not working properly, but the users don't notice. And I feel like that's an important challenge, when you talk about, a really effective IT department is, it's not that nothing ever goes wrong. It's that does the business even notice or need to worry?
Right. Obviously, your role is the IT director of data and governance, risk and compliance. So even by the name of your title, that is something that is always on your mind. So I'm actually curious, what, for listeners out there in the IT world, in the IT professional sort of area, where should someone start? Because cybersecurity, business continuity, right? Like you said, is hugely important for all of IT, not just back then, but even now. Where should IT professionals start or really learn more about when it comes to cybersecurity and business continuity to ensure that users never see what is going on within an IT department?
I would say that there are two things that I believe are crucially important to, you could say, business continuity, right? That's probably the biggest thing, is building an IT structure that has resiliency, the ability to recover. And we don't always have the budget for it. I mean, let's just be realistic. I'd like to have 2 of every server that I have in production. And I don't mean like a dev server. I mean 2 production servers. So if one goes down, the other one, takes over and no one even notices. Realistically, that's not possible in our budgets. So what you look at is where you can have that redundancy. And sometimes that redundancy is that you have a secondary service rather than a whole nother server, so maybe you have a service where, we can keep, a database going. It's just going to be slower, but it's still available. It's still working, right? While we get the primary production system, back online. Is I would look at resiliency and how to recover from degraded service. I would learn about that as an IT person. It's seen as a component of cybersecurity only in that cybersecurity often is involved in disaster recovery and incidents. However, before we were even calling it cybersecurity, BCDR was a basic part of IT.
Yeah.
I mean, that it just always was. So I feel like learning the to build redundancy, learning to build resiliency is an important one. The other part I would say, if you're getting started in, anything related to cybersecurity, is to understand the different parts of security. And what I would say, and this is going to sound very trope, and all the people who have their Security Plus, CISSP, all those certifications are going to know this one really well. And I feel like sometimes it gets lip service because it seems very boring or repetitive, is the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You get drilled that. If you're going to try to get certified, you have to drill on that. You got to do flashcards on it. You got to memorize it really well. However, I feel like that shouldn't be discounted. That understanding that every time you look at a problem, is it endangering confidentiality? Is it endangering data integrity? Is it endangering the availability of a system or availability of data? The CIA triad, it's applicable to me to everything in IT, not just InfoSec.
There's a strangely holistic way of, when you look at IT, at least from what you're saying, it's almost as if, of course, there are segments within IT, but everything kind of is related to everything, and everything can be a cybersecurity sort of risk. And so even if it's just something as small as, I don't even know if it's small, I don't know, buying a new mobile device. You got to make sure that the installation of the device, the ordering of the device, the managing of the device keeps up that triad as well. It's in everything. So I think that's a curious thought for sure.
I think of it like, when you look at things like, the Japanese reference to Bushido, right? The way of the sword.
Yeah.
Right. Is I have a particular interest in it. That's why I'm familiar with that, is that training apprentices on the basics for, 10, 15 years, right? And thinking, yeah, but they've been doing the exact, what more are they going to learn in 10 years of doing the exact same exercise? But they do.
Yeah.
You actually do, right? Like 10 years later, it's like, you understand now the nuance of how important that basic was. And I kind of look at the CIA triad that way, is that IT keeping its basics is really crucial.
Yeah. And I think that's applicable for everything in life too, right? Mastering the basics. But yeah, I won't dive into any deeper on that. Again, your title, IT director, we're going to jump into, your particular situation in a bit, but IT director of data and governance, risk and compliance, GRC. I could talk to a CIO, right? Or a VP of IT. That's way more generic, right? Way more higher up. What kind of is the day-to-day of somebody in your particular role? What do you focus on? What are your priorities?
Well, first I'll explain how I even came to be in that particular job title. I was having a series of discussions with our enterprise architect about where we were seeing gaps in IT. And these gaps were not dangerous gaps. They were just, what are the things we're not applying extra attention to that we'd like to spend time on, both from a information security standpoint and from a process standpoint, make the business better kind of approach. And so we came up with that title because of the fact that we wanted to pay attention to these things. So we were already doing a bunch of data projects. We had stood up a data lake where we could look at sales and things like that. And I had worked on a project to bring payroll data, not just payroll when it's done data, but like to bring hours from our time and attendance system and integrate that into our data lake so that we could project sales. We could take, like yesterday's up to yesterday's sales, literally up to yesterday. We could take that sales data and put the hours that were clocked yesterday. When you close payroll every 2 weeks, you don't have a picture of late. You're always 2 weeks late, up to 2 weeks late in terms of looking at payroll data. So we were able to take yesterday's hours from the field and yesterday's sales from the point of sale and put those together in, dashboards. And so we could actually make business decisions based on, knowing what happened up to yesterday. Now, true, a lot of our decisions are better made with what happened, this time last year versus this time this year, the normal kind of data things. But being able to have both the real time, near real time, and historical alignment of payroll and sales really helped. And it helped in a way that was beneficial from a decision-making standpoint, in a general way. But the other place it helped was what we would call comparative store management. And that's where the data component of my title comes from. I've worked for a few different multi-location retailers, not exactly the same as being in the paint business, but multi-location retail where you're dealing with sales, what we call day part sales. You're looking at throughout the day, right? So morning, mid-morning, afternoon, those kind of things. And you're looking at the labor that's involved. And so the data component of my title came from my experience with knowing that and how to help the IT team support the business in developing better data points, better data structure, that we could use for business decision making. The other component of it was, like I said, is what we call comparative store, or you could say comparative management. So for example, in California, we have a meal penalty thing. If you go over 5 hours, you have daily overtime. In other states, we had weekly overtime. So we could look at in our dashboards, comparative stores. You have two stores that are a couple miles apart in fairly similar markets, or maybe even a whole other city, but in comparative markets, city to city, right? And you could say, what does the data look like? Oh, well, we have a store where a manager's doing really well with less headcount, better hours management, and meeting sales goals. We have a store that has more headcount, more overtime, more issues with payroll, right? And not making the sales numbers we want. Or they're making the, comparative sales numbers, but they're working much harder to do it. And so even though that's not really an IT thing, that's really more of a business analyst, you could almost branch that into a finance kind of area. Our ability to gather that data and place it in some place where the business could look at it that way was one of my areas of focus. I mentioned before that in some previous jobs I had worked on data warehousing, is looking at the data, looking at how can we make the data available, how can we make the data comparative and corollary so the business could use it. So that's the data component of my title. So in that data area, when it comes to day-to-day job, my day-to-day job was more around things like just making sure everything was still working, that all the feeds were working, all the integration was working with the analysts that were making sure all that functioned. The other component was to have those discussions with the business. Is this working for you? Is there something more we can get you? Is there another way to look at this data? And then the final component, which kind of bleeds over into my GRC role, is the data governance component. Who should be allowed to see this data? Who should be allowed to see what parts of this data? So you have salespeople and sales management in the field. Is it, maybe at a higher level, at a regional or district level, it's okay for them to see hours relative to sales, but it's really not the business of an individual sales rep or maybe even an individual sales manager at a low level to be seeing the labor, data connected to those sales, because it's not their job to manage that labor. Mm-hmm. It is the business of the operations team, store operations management, right? To manage labor. So that's where the data governance comes in. And that's why we had decided when I literally took this proposal to the CEO and the CEO was like, yeah, we should do that. Is that I explained without those two things being conjoined, we would actually end up with two headcount that had to spend all their time talking to each other, which is somebody who helps with data and data management, working with someone who helps manage governance of data and make sure it's safe.
But that's only a small component of your GRC, as you were saying, right? You don't just do GRC for data. I don't know what else GRC can look for.
Well, the other part that GRC does, which speaks to my cybersecurity background and the years that I have built up in learning to understand compliance and risk, was that I kind of started the security journey out of just straight IT, and that I worked on a series of projects around identity and identity management. And that's what kind of brought me into the security scope of things. And as I worked on that more and more, I started to look at, okay, how does identity relate to people data and people management? And it was kind of an organic thing where I just kept taking kind of the next step and the next step. You get into people management, you get into compliance. Are we training staff? Are we training IT to make sure that we remain in compliance. Our organization was subject to PCI. And for those that aren't familiar, that's payment card information. It's an industry thing, not a government regulation, but it does mean that if you fail to comply with PCI, they turn off your ability to take credit cards. So it is important to the business. As I moved more and more in the people technology relationship, I started to move more and more into areas where we needed to touch compliance. PCI has a lot of controls in it that are not just IT controls. They're also people controls. Are people doing the things they're supposed to be doing? Are we granting more identity, a more privilege within identity than they should have? So it was an organic growth that I just kept being, taking that next step. And when California's CCPA came out, there was an employee component to that. And at first, they didn't enforce that. But in 2023, that employee component, or I should say, employment-related component folded into that. But even before that, you had the customer component, and you had customer identity component, and customer identifiable information, a PII around customers, then PII around employees. As this regulation, and because we had such a large footprint in California, these regulations became something that we needed to understand. And so a component of me moving into this particular director role with the GRC component was that I had been the early advocate for, we need to look at CCPA, when really no one in IT had really been paying attention to it because it just wasn't prominent. And what I looked at was, okay, at some point, we're going to have to secure the data involved in this. So we're going to have to respond to requests. Luckily, it's not been a huge avalanche of requests, but respond to requests for data, possibly delete requests, things like that, similar to GDPR. So because of my interest in that, I essentially ended up volunteering to become the expert on compliance.
Let's see.
So the final part is risk, right? I explained governance kind of grew out of how do we keep our data safe? Compliance grew out of what are things that are going to affect our management of IT systems and management of data that we handle. The final part came from a discussion with the head of IT, discussing with her, how do we improve our overall IT strategy in light of all the data breaches, in light of all the cybersecurity incidents happening, and even just IT trying to be effective with our budget. And since I was able to give her kind of an outside perspective, looking at IT, not from an operations standpoint, not from running an infrastructure, but kind of standing on the edge of IT, looking in, was my recommendation to her. And what we were building in the last couple of years was a risk-based model. What are the things that are placing our systems at risk? This goes back to that CIA triad, which is, are we risking any of these three things? And we look at every system, every service that we provide and figure out what the CIA priority is of it, and therefore what to do with it. So for example, we had an in-depth discussion with, we had a few different IT directors and the VP of IT. We had an in-depth discussion to talk about risk and to talk about how we would align. And at the particular time, we decided that of the CIA triad, we weren't going to discount any of them. All three were important, but which one was on top? And that doesn't mean we neglect any, just is integrity on top? Is confidentiality on top? Is availability, right? And that really helped in terms of where do we spend? If availability is your number one, you spend on all infrastructure redundancy, server redundancy, everything else, and you're not neglecting the other things. You're just balancing your budget to that, your prioritization, right? In our particular case, because we were becoming a data-driven organization, like that, the dashboard I mentioned, where the business wanted to make decisions based on data, not based on other, subjective metrics, or you could say They wanted to stick to qualitative instead of quantitative metrics of the business. Is integrity became top priority. That we weren't going to guard confidentiality, not that we weren't going to make sure we had redundant systems for availability, but integrity became our number one priority, because anything wrong with the data meant bad decisions.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. No, I appreciate you sharing all of this. I think diving into, sometimes we look at role titles and we go, oh, that's a role title. But for you to really be in line with what your role title is and be able to speak to it, I think is really awesome. And just hearing about just the depth, and I would almost say love, passion might be the better word. The passion you have for the role that you do is awesome, just to hear you talk about it. And I feel like, you live up to the name of your title really, really well, and you want it to succeed. That being said, though, like we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that's stuff that your role entailed generally, but you're at a juncture where the company that you work for is closing, is shutting down, and you had mentioned that you're kind of one of the last IT people at the company, kind of just doing closing tasks. What is that experience like? I don't really know what questions to really ask until you start talking about it, because it's such a unique situation. But what does that entail? It's not the same thing as data. You're not trying to do data-driven decisions anymore, or necessarily doing GRC to an intense sort of extent. So what kind of entails the job until it's over?
Well, I can tell you what is kind of a different experience is that when you are closing down the business, that one is you have the one of the most crucial things, I think, is that you have, especially when you have like mass layoffs, for example. And this doesn't even necessarily need to be a closing down business. This could just be mass layoffs in any organization, right? Is identity management, right? Being certain that all those logins are turned off, right? And just as importantly is not just those logins, right? Sometimes, identity quite frequently is folded into infrastructure. Let's just be realistic. With most IT departments, logins are in the infrastructure, the people managing servers and Active Directory. Like that's kind of, their job, unless you have an identity management team in really large organizations, right? So you have an infrastructure team that now been told, okay, we got to make sure all these logins are turned off, right? One of the lucky things was the fact that we had spent years automating identity. So at least with things like Active Directory and Microsoft 365, our automation was already there. So even though we might go in, preemptively when the communication goes out, during the day, we had a fail safe, which is that at the end of the day, of any day where someone has an end date, their login's turned off automatically. So we could miss someone and we're not going to discover next, the Monday, let's say it's a Friday, right? We're not going to discover the Monday after that they logged in on Saturday and exfiltrated, 14 gigs of data. Like, oops, there is no oops, right? So it's not something you want to plan for, but it just sort of worked out really well that because we had identity automation, that doing mass deprovisioning wasn't as concerning as it would be for an organization that's very manual. You don't have to have someone over there with, running PowerShell scripts to deprovision a bunch of people, and unfortunately, we're human, right? We make mistakes, right? They deprovisioned, let's say they deprovisioned everyone except one person that they missed on the list for some reason because of the list they got from HR or whatever, right? But by the way, someone who's not supposed to be let go till the week after, or a whole group of people who haven't been told they're being let go accidentally got deprovisioned too.
Yeah. Right.
And they're calling up help desk, right, on Monday morning going, I can't log in. Am I fired?
Oh, that's tragic. That's a tough situation to be in.
So I would just say that, as much as we don't want to be in those situations of mass layoffs and company shutdowns, automation of identity really helps and really takes a lot of the stress off the IT team to be sure that it's done right and accurately. And, and really then it's really about, are the people systems up to date, right? Is the HR team, right, putting in the layoff entries, making sure the right people are on the list and that they're updated, in our case, in the HR system. So then our automation just draws from it and it works. So I would say, if you're going to go through this, that's a really good place to be, is identity automation. It just really helps. The other part that we had to spend time on was, of course, equipment, right?
Yeah.
Were we recovering equipment? Were, all that kind of thing, right? And one of the things that's valuable is that if you have an organization that's very focused on identity automation, is to be able to make sure that those resources are secured, right? So by having an identity automation that's tied to Office 365, things like that, or should I say Microsoft 365, is that also means that, your SharePoint and all your SSO apps, they got to go through Active Directory to get to those apps, right? You're really just dealing with, there's some devices in the field. You're not dealing with, there's devices that will retain access to resources, because it's not dependent on the device. It's dependent on the identity. Right. So having that, process to go through. The other part is that when you're dealing in the field, right, a lot of IT directors have to deal with PCI. We have to deal with, what's sitting in the field. So, we were not a huge, card processor, right? We weren't in the, tens of millions of transactions a year. So we didn't have the same kind of third-party attestation, that other organizations had. You look at Target, Walmart, they have their own PCI people on staff. So we were in a position where, because we didn't have the third-party part, our enterprise architect and our team had approached it from the standpoint of, we want to be as safe as possible within our budget, but as safe as possible for ourselves. We want to be the good, caretakers, right? Practice due care in our PCI space. So our boxes in the stores, for example, had encryption. We were using end-to-end encryption for the EMV and the credit card processing. So really, we could shut down and there wasn't anything sitting in the field that someone could physically steal and do anything, and that, I feel like, is also an important component when you're dealing with shutdown, or it could be dealing, let's say, with a natural disaster. You're dealing with like a hurricane or something, right? And you've got, we've got 12 stores that are, that are without power, damaged by flood, what have you, right? The physical integrity of them may be compromised, right? Somebody could go in and physically pull your point of sale. So having the proper due care is what helps, right? So you're in a position where, someone could physically grab that thing. The point of sale really isn't going to do anything with, payment card information or any of that, because it's not that we didn't put ourselves in that position. So I'd say one thing that I have really learned about the closeout process has been really around this thing of the things we did right in running the business made us safer in the shutdown.
Oh, yeah. Because obviously you don't, like you said, you never want to envision that your company is going to shut down or that you're going to have mass layoffs. You never want to be like, oh, that's going to happen. But it does happen, right? And so being able to plan for something like that way earlier, just for security purposes in general, makes this whole process a lot easier, because it's so interesting, and your role is super important to the task of closing down. Is, it's not just closing and it's over. You still want to make sure that data is secure, that identity is secure. And so it's interesting that your role is still just as important as ever because you want to make sure that everything is protected after the fact that everything is all over. So it's very interesting. Very interesting.
The other part that's not always, I mean, maybe it is talked about, and there just isn't kind of a whole big discussion around company shutdowns or even just, mass layout. Let's say there's a division of your company. So it's not your entire company going out of business, but you're just shutting down a division of your company. Is who gets the data afterwards?
Yeah.
Right. And in our case, we have an archive process and we're going through a process so that, it's legally retained as it needs to be. Right. So when there are no more employees, actual employees of the company, there is a place that is safe and legal for data to be retrieved for the period it needs to be available. So there is a caretaker process, right? Because, there's going to be residual things, especially for employees. For customers, there could be customer things and that's all well and good. But the fact of the matter is that there are employees that, that have residual effects of being laid off. Right. And being able to be in a position where we could, curate that data and be able to make it available to them, can I get my last few earnings statements? Can I get my W-2 and things like that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all things that also need to be accounted for in the closeout process or even in the mass layoff. I look at very large organizations. You have teams that are trying to do their day job and run a 50,000, 100,000 person organization. And you do, 10, 20,000 people laid off over, let's say, a 6-month period. For a couple of years afterwards, you have teams that have to respond to those 10,000 people, right, that were laid off who need things. They need records, right? Records of employment, tax information, those, payroll, right? They need those things, to finish their roll off, right, of the organization.
Yeah.
And that's true whether you're closing or just doing mass layoffs.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes that's not understood, the amount of work that's built into that. It's also something that I think that every organization needs to understand from like an executive level is that, for example, in any of these organizations, how do you secure that data and how do you keep it securely available for the period of time, that you do the roll off?
That's interesting. That's super interesting. For sure. The job doesn't stop when people quit or people leave or you have to let people go. They will still need to contact you down the line and you have to make sure that data is readily accessible and that it's also confidential and it's also it holds integrity. All of it. the triad still.
The triad still. And also, can you have systems, when you're a closed down company, there's a period where you're going to keep some systems online. Right. And then eventually you'll shut those systems off and that, that's kind of it, right? The last of the light get turned off. Whereas if you're doing mass layoffs as a company that's continued to operate, right? Can you build in a budget to keep some of those systems online, right? So for example, having self-service for your terminated employees to go get their tax forms and their earning statements, right? Because that's less burden on HR and IT, right? The two who are going to be servicing these requests, right? They're not going to have, 10,000 people bugging them for earning statements if those 10,000 people can log in somewhere and get it for themselves. So I feel, I don't want to just speak doom and gloom. I also want to speak in terms of there are ways, especially in mass layoffs, where you do retain some component of the company still operating, where you can reduce that burden. You can make it a manageable thing to work through a roll off of people.
No, this is all interesting stuff. I definitely have some follow-up questions, and I think I'll have to do it after the call because we're at time. So for the sake of everyone listening, the final question for you, and then we'll close, is kind of just a soapbox moment of what are some of the most important lessons you've learned over your career that you'd like to impart on the IT audience?
I would say one of the most important, probably the most important lesson that I learned is to keep things simple. Every time we try to make something better by adding a bunch of complexity, either it fails to fulfill the goal we were after, or the complexity ends up being what goes wrong. Like we end up having to go back and fix things because we made something overly complex. The other thing that I would say, besides the keeping it simple, is I'm going to say the thing that no one likes to do and no one wants to hear, which is document everything. Absolutely document everything. You are, as I like to say, if someone was hit by a bus tomorrow, I know it's awful to say, but for whatever reason, someone became unavailable, right? Which could be totally not their fault, right? You don't know how something works.
Yeah.
So I would say those would be my two lessons learned over the years: is keep things simple and document everything.
No, I think that's I know you said that no one wants to hear that, but I think that needs to be heard. And because I've experienced countless times where lack of documentation was very inconvenience, not even the right word. It was detrimental, and it made it very, very hard. So I agree with you on both points. But Joe, I just wanted to say thank you for your time. This was a really unique conversation, I will say, compared to the rest of the podcast, because it's not every day you get to talk about what it's like to shut down, but also just hearing you talk about outside of that, just the role that you play and the passion you have for data and for governance, for risk, for compliance, I think is awesome. So I just want to thank you for your time and your expertise and your knowledge, for sure.
Thank you for having me.
Well, have a good one and take care.
We hope you enjoyed this Keeping IT Real episode, and thank you for listening. Make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. This podcast is all about celebrating and connecting professional heroes who work hard at IT every day. To continue the conversation and learn how VCOM can help you better buy, manage, and pay for your technology, visit us at vcomsolutions.com. Until next time.